Hello and welcome to another episode of Album Musings. So in this episode we're going to be taking a look at the Belly album Star. It was released on January the 25th, 1993, and by a happy accident this video is actually going to be uploaded for release on January the 25th, 2023. It's happened, I think, a couple of times already where I've got a bit of a line-up. I don't necessarily intend it that way. I mean, try and get the album roughly to the week it was released, but sometimes the stars align. So Star is the debut album by American alternative rock band Belly. And it's got here in the Wikipedia article about the composition, it says, along with alternative rock and jangle pop, the sounds on Star also dig into haunting avant folk rock. Tanya Donnelly was credited with pushing dream pop's boundaries by trimming away its pretensions while keeping its trancey harmonies. A distinct post-punk quality has also been seen in the music alongside some country and spaghetti western influences. So as I do in all of these episodes, I want to look at this album through the lens of the UK, and specifically when the album was released and also when the singles that were released off the back of this album, what impact, if any, that had on the charts, and what I sort of remember when I heard particularly the singles in terms of other things that were going on around that period. I think I've probably mentioned this in one of the videos I've done for, in this year in 2023, is a very interesting period in the UK charts, which I'm sure I'll talk about a bit more in this episode. So just to place this in the chronologically in the studio albums, obviously, as was mentioned in that article, it's their debut album, and there's 3 albums listed in here. We've got Star, King and Dove, and you can see the first 2 came out within 2 years of one another, and then we have this later album, Dove. In these episodes I tend not to go so much in the sort of history of the band, but obviously there's a logical explanation there as to why there's such a big gap. You can see, and this is something I've actually just dawned on me, and I know it was super popular at the time with a lot of indie bands, was releasing quite a lot of EPs. Now, I'm not sure if they did it. Let me look forward to compilation albums. No, I don't think they did. But what would often happen is a band, a good example here I think is Lush, from what I remember, is they had some EPs out and then they released the EPs sort of as a collection as well. And I noticed that a lot of 90s bands across multiple genres, that seemed to be the case, where alongside their studio albums there were these EPs coming out, and then later, because in the 90s we're very much into the era of the CD, those EPs were then collected together on CDs. You can see there's the band stopped, as we could just see from the timeline here, for quite a number of years and then reformed. So I'll include a link here so you can dig deeper into the history of the band. So we have 12 tracks on the album. So we are firmly in the CD format age. Nominated for a Grammy Award for Best Alternative Album, while Belly were nominated for Best New Artist. 15 tracks. You can see here a lot of high scores on the various magazine ratings. 4 singles. I'm only going to be really talking about 2 because the other 2 listed here didn't scrape the charts in any form at all. And I'm probably going to focus most on Feed the Tree because this is the one I remember the most. Pretty straightforward lineup for the album. So you can see we've got a 4-piece with a bit of additional work here provided by Chick Groening. Looks like Gil Norton handled the production on this alongside the band. And as I hover there, you can sort of see the other work that Gil Norton's been involved with. So charts and certifications. The album got to number 2 in the UK album charts. US Billboard got 59 on the 200 and number 1 on the Heatseeker album. From what I gather, and we'll see this, the album was released in the UK and got on the charts pretty quickly. In terms of certifications, went silver in the UK and then gold in the US. And then looking alongside the popularity of their albums as determined by Album of the Year, you can see it's listed here as the most popular. Have a quick look here at the chart run. So the album, as we've seen, was released the previous month. So it was on the 25th and got in at number 2 on the UK album charts within a couple of weeks really, and then just slowly rolled out, jumped back in again. And then if you look alongside, there are other albums that were released later. So this one was 2 years later, got to number 6, was on the chart for 4 weeks. And then the one in 2018 got to number 34 and was on the chart for 1 week. And just so you see what else was going on in the UK charts at the time when it got to its highest chart position. It's number 2, straight in at number 2. That's pretty good on an independent. And I'm going to talk a little bit about 4AD, the record label, at the end of this video as well. So number 1 at that point was the compilation by The Cult, Pure Cult. We've got Arrested Development, On Vogue, Paul McCartney had an album out. This is a cool classical piece, Gorecki Symphony No. 3. It's one of my favourites. Oh, Snap. So, that style of, I don't know whether I'd call it Eurodisco, but that was still really popular. We had Stereo MCs, REM, Automatic for the People, and so on. Oh, Little Angels and The Shaman. I'll be talking about this album in a later episode, actually. 808 States, gorgeous. Keep the Faith by Bon Jovi. This album by Jesus Jones was actually released around the same week as the Belly album. And before we jump into the single side of things, I thought I'd have a quick look at their singles ratings in the UK charts. Now, what's interesting is this single was actually released the previous year in 92. Didn't chart in the UK at the time. This was the second single of the album. And it got to number 32, was on the UK singles charts for 3 weeks. And I think this is when I first became aware of the band, was this being played on the radio. It's interesting because I remember it being, pretty heavily played, but it didn't even scrape the top 20. And then off the back of that, this then charted, well, I say chart, it got into the top 75 or the top 100, but didn't get into the top 40. So I don't remember this single at all, but as I've said, it was released before this one. Now these are later singles. There were actually 4 singles off the album, but these aren't them. These are off later albums, the next album. And they didn't chart at all in the UK, the 2 follow-up singles to these 2. So I'm not going to be talking about those. Let's just look at Feed the Tree. So as it says here, number 32 on the UK singles charts. Ranked number 24 on VH1's 40 Greatest One-Hit Wonders of the 90s. And yeah, this is another thing that fascinates me at the time. All these different formats that were available. So you had, the CD single, the cassette single, the 7-inch single, the 12-inch and the CD single. So you can see here, this is the first single, this is Feed the Tree, and then Now They'll Sleep, the third, which didn't chart. And then there was a single after that, Slow Dog. Oh, hang on, sorry. I stand corrected. That was sort of the next album. So they don't even list, that's curious, they don't even list Full Moon, Empty Heart or Slow Dog at all. They don't even reference that. So I'm not sure what form they took, because sometimes they get listed here and it turns out they're, video releases for MTV or something like that. But yeah, he's never appeared in the UK. So I got to number 32 in the UK, Feed the Tree. And we could sort of see what that was alongside. So we've got I Will Always Love You, which was enjoying a phenomenal stint on the number 1 position, 11 weeks on the charts. Exterminate by Snap, I'm Easy by Faith No More, Take That were in the charts. Arrested Development, Beloved, Peter Gabriel, Shaman were doing pretty well. This is an interesting band. I don't know if I'm going to get to talk about them, if they specifically released an album in 93. But they were an indie band, and they sort of crossed over into dance music and had this really interesting hybrid for a time. And this was during that sort of hybrid period. Wood by Alice in Chains. Devil You Know by Jesus Jones. So there's Feed the Tree by Belly. We've got Gloria Estefan as well with Miami Hit Mix. Did I see... Oh, Prefab Sprout were lurking around still. Wow. That's a band I was big into in the 80s. Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about this album. It's a good album, actually. Now, Geppetto, which was the first single, and then it had a later, 2-week run on the higher end of the charts, so you wouldn't have really been aware of it in the UK charts. As far as I know, they never did a full rundown. They only did the top 40. So just a couple of weeks. When it had its best position, that's what was around. So we're getting to April now. So the Bluebells, Young at Heart, Shaggy, Oh Carolina, Mr. Loverman by Shabba Ranks. Oh, Too Unlimited, yeah. All these sort of Euro disco bands. Capella, Gloria Estefan. Oh, Duran Duran. Come Undone. Oh, Beloved. So, I want to talk a little bit about 4AD. So, this is the record label that they were on. And I became aware of this label in the 80s, and I almost like used it as a stamp of quality. So the idea with the 4AD record label was, when it was at its inception, it was owned by Beggars Banquet. And the plan with the record label, I think it mentions down here, an initial idea for the label was that it would be a testing ground for Beggars Banquet. So successful acts would graduate up to Beggars Banquet after a year on 4AD. Now, the only band where that was actually the case was Bauhaus, and that was because what happened was, and I think it was just due to the success of the label, the people at Beggars Banquet or Beggars Group that were involved with it, decided to actually purchase the label outright and run it as its own entity. Now, ultimately, they did sell it back later to Beggars Banquet. But for me, it was always this label which I associated with like 80s alternate rock, post-punk, gothic rock, Bauhaus, Cocteau Twins, Dead Can Dance, Clan of X-Mox, alongside Pixies and Throwing Muses. Also this Mortal Coil, which I suppose you could call like a goth sort of super group to some degree. But then also they had this big hit with a dance band, which was Pump Up the Volume in 87. And then subsequently in the 90s, they went on to feature other bands, some of whom you may well recognise here. National Deer Hunter and so on. So yeah, really interesting UK-based record label that has been the home of a lot of very influential, alternative rock, post-punk, gothic rock, dream pop artists, and then went on to, take on a lot more recent acts as well. So for me, what was so fascinating, and I think I've mentioned this in a previous video, is, like I said, in that period in the 90s on the UK charts, just the sheer amount of diversity. Because what you had was the tail end of that sort of first wave on the charts of grunge music. You had almost like a reaction going on to shoegaze in lots of different ways. Like shoegaze was I think seen as the antithesis of Britpop. So a lot of bands weren't particularly complimentary of shoegaze. But what also happened was several shoegaze bands, well, one in particular I can think of, which is Lush, had some success under the sort of, Britpop period, the Britpop period, because they slightly changed their sound, I think. I don't know how intentional that was, but it seemed to lose some of the swathed in echo sound of shoegaze. But then you've got other stuff going on, like the whole trip hop. As we saw, there were a couple of artists that I saw. There was Shaggy, who have sort of reggae and dancehall influences in their music, alongside, I think, Paul Weller in the early 90s, in that period, around 93, was having about his third career by then. He'd previously been in the Jam, he'd been in the Style Council, and then he had this more sort of rootsy sound, which is effectively his solo work, with I think tracks like Wild Wood, and that was really popular. And as a result of that, you got the impression that a lot of the Brit rock bands had pulled in, either intentionally or not, influences from like early bands that were influential on the original mod movement, like the Faces and things like that. So it was this real interesting, diverse collection of hybrid genres and new genres and subgenres on all sorts of different music, some of which was making the charts and others which wasn't, just because of the nature of the music. And so it just spawned all this interesting stuff around that period. And I'm sure in subsequent episodes where I do mention about the 90s, I'm probably going to repeat myself, but that's my big thing that I remember is just listening to the radio at the time and all this different stuff being played by not only UK based bands, but bands like Belly, alternative rock from the States, but they had that jangle pop sound, and that was another. I don't know if it happened, was something from them directly, but I got the impression that a lot of the UK bands that had been associated with shoegaze certainly went a little bit more jangly in the post rock period, in the sort of Brit rock period. And then alongside that, you had these other bands which didn't really want to get too associated with that whole movement for various reasons. I think Radiohead were just about to have their first album out. I think it was a period then when the Manic Street Preachers were in the ascendancy. So yeah, just in really fascinating times. So thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I'll catch you in the next episode.